She signed the divorce papers with steady hands, not because she wasn't breaking inside, but because she had learned, in 7 years of loving a man built from concrete and shadows, that showing pain to people like Roman Dragunov was the same as handing them a weapon. What Roman didn't know, what no one in that cold penthouse knew, was that tucked inside her handbag was a small black and white photograph, a heartbeat, a secret that would take 6 years, 2 empires, and one devastating truth to finally detonate. Before we go further, if stories about betrayal, survival, and savage comebacks are your kind of thing, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what's coming next. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, hit that like button, and let's begin. The clinic was on the corner of 5th and Madison, wedged between a dry cleaner and a pharmacy that smelled like old plastic and antiseptic. Celeste Dragunov sat in a paper gown that crinkled every time she breathed, staring at a water stain on the ceiling, while the ultrasound technician moved the cold wand across her abdomen without saying a word. Celeste had been here before, 3 times in 4 years. Each time she had climbed onto this same table, stared at that same ceiling, and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of hope before the results came back and stripped it away again. The fertility specialist, a careful man with a careful voice, had told her after the last round of treatments that natural conception was, in his words, statistically unlikely. He'd said it gently, as if gentle packaging could soften what it actually meant. It meant she was broken in a way that mattered to the Dragunov family. It meant every holiday dinner where Roman's mother, Elena, let her gaze drop to Celeste's flat stomach carried the weight of a verdict. It meant 7 years of marriage had produced everything except the one thing the family demanded. So Celeste had stopped hoping. She had trained herself the way you train yourself not to look at a scar, deliberately, repetitively, until not looking became habit. Which was why, when the technician finally spoke, Celeste almost didn't hear her. Mrs. Dragunov. The woman's voice had changed. Something warmer in it now, something Celeste couldn't immediately identify. "Do you want to see?" She turned her head. The monitor was grainy and gray and small, but in the center of all that static, there it was. A flicker, a rhythm, unmistakable. Celeste sat up so fast the paper gown tore at the shoulder. "Is that 14 weeks?" The technician smiled. "Strong heartbeat. You've been pregnant since early spring." The room didn't spin. That's what people said, wasn't it? The room spun. My knees went weak. I burst into tears. None of that happened. Instead, everything went very, very still. Like the moment before a thunderclap when all the sound gets sucked out of the air and the world holds its breath. Celeste looked at the monitor for a long time without speaking. Then she asked, very quietly, "Can I have a copy of that image?" She walked out of the clinic 40 minutes later with the ultrasound photograph folded carefully inside a white envelope, tucked into the inner pocket of her handbag where she kept her most important things. The May air hit her face, and she stood on the sidewalk for a moment, blinking in the light, feeling something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten the texture of it. She felt lucky. She thought about calling Roman. Her thumb hovered over his name in her phone for a long moment, but then she decided against it. He was in back-to-back meetings until noon. She knew his schedule better than he did. And this was not the kind of news you delivered over the phone. This was champagne and a quiet dinner and his face when she slid the photograph across the table. She wanted to see his face. Roman Dragunov did not show emotion easily. That was something you learned about him quickly. His face in most situations was a controlled, unreadable surface. The same face he wore, whether he was closing a $200 million deal or hearing that a business rival had been hospitalized. But Celeste had spent 7 years studying the exceptions. The small muscle under his left eye that flickered when he was genuinely moved. The way his jaw loosened, almost imperceptibly, when something caught him off guard in a good way. She wanted to see those small tells. She had been waiting 7 years to see them about something like this. She took a cab home. The Dragunov penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building on the Upper East Side that Roman had purchased 3 years into their marriage. The kind of building where the elevator required a private key and the lobby concierge knew your name before you'd ever introduced yourself. Celeste knew the doorman, Marcus, a quiet man in his 60s who always held the door without being asked and never commented on the hours Roman kept or the people who came and went. Today, Marcus was not at the door. The lobby was empty. She told herself it was nothing. Marcus took breaks, other staff covered, and stepped into the elevator, pressing the button for the penthouse level with her pulse beating faster than usual. Not from nerves. From something closer to joy, which felt strange in her chest because she'd been keeping it at arm's length for so long. The elevator opened directly into the penthouse foyer, a private entrance. No hallway between the elevator and the front door. Roman had insisted on it when they bought the place. Privacy was not a preference for him. It was a survival strategy. The door was unlocked. That was the first thing she noticed. Roman was meticulous about security. Locked doors were non-negotiable. She'd watched him go back twice after leaving the apartment just to verify the deadbolt had engaged. An unlocked door meant someone was already here, or had left in a hurry, or... She pushed it open. The living room was dim, the curtains half drawn against the mid-morning sun. And there, standing near the window where the light came in sideways and lit them both like a painting Celeste hadn't chosen to look at, was her husband. And in front of him, close enough that she could see the woman's fingers resting against Roman's chest, was Isabella Moretti. Celeste stopped walking. Isabella Moretti was 29 years old and had the particular kind of beauty that photographed well at charity galas and intimidated women in boardrooms. She was the eldest daughter of Domenico Moretti, one of the 3 New York crime bosses whose support Roman had been carefully, painstakingly courting for the better part of 2 years. She was also, as Celeste had been told by Roman himself, a strategic necessity, a business contact, nothing personal, nothing personal. Isabella looked up when Celeste entered. She did not step back. That was the detail Celeste would remember later, that Isabella did not step back, did not remove her hand from Roman's chest, did not offer any of the instinctive gestures of innocence that a person reaches for when caught in a compromising position. She simply looked at Celeste with dark, composed eyes and let the moment breathe. Roman turned a second later. Something passed across his face. It might have been surprise, or calculation, or both, but it did not look like guilt. That was the thing that broke something inside Celeste that she hadn't known was still breakable. He did not look like a man who had been caught. He looked like a man dealing with an inconvenient interruption. Celeste, his voice was flat. I didn't expect you until this afternoon. She didn't answer him right away. She was looking at Isabella, and Isabella was looking back at her. And in the space between them was something that had no name but was heavier than anything Celeste had carried into this apartment. I had a doctor's appointment, Celeste said finally. Her voice came out steady. She didn't know how. I came home early. Ms. Moretti and I were discussing the terms of the family merger. I can see that. Roman's jaw tightened. Isabella, to her credit, finally stepped back, smoothing the front of her jacket with the practiced composure of someone who had rehearsed for this moment. I should give you some privacy, she said, in a voice that managed to sound gracious and triumphant simultaneously. She picked up her bag from the sofa. Celeste noticed the way she knew exactly where she'd set it, the way the apartment already held the shape of someone who'd been here before, and walked toward the elevator without hurrying. The doors closed. Roman and Celeste stood 12 feet apart in a room that cost more than most people earned in a decade, and neither of them spoke. Then the door at the other end of the hall opened, and Elena Dragunov walked in. Roman's mother was 63 years old, and had never once in Celeste's memory entered a room without already knowing exactly what she intended to say. She was a compact woman, elegantly dressed, with Roman's same dark eyes, and none of Roman's occasional capacity for warmth. She had disapproved of Celeste from the beginning, not loudly, not cruelly, but consistently, in the way that water consistently erodes stone. 7 years of careful, sustained disapproval. Good, Elena said when she saw Celeste. You're here. She moved to the dining table and placed a folder on it, pushing it forward an inch so it sat directly in front of the chair Celeste usually sat in. This has gone on long enough. Celeste looked at the folder, then at Roman. He was looking at the floor. "What is this?" she asked. "The marriage has not produced what this family needs," Elena said. "Roman has worked himself to exhaustion, building something that requires a future. You have failed to provide that future. The Moretti alliance is an opportunity to correct that." She said it the way you might describe a problematic business restructuring. Clean, categorical, as if Celeste were a balance sheet that had come up short. "The papers are drawn up. The settlement is more than generous. You will be taken care of." Celeste did not move. The white envelope in her handbag felt like it had tripled in weight. She looked at Roman. She waited. She had been in enough silences with him to know that he heard every word of what wasn't being said. She was giving him the chance to speak, to correct this, to take one step forward and stop whatever was about to happen. He said nothing. He said absolutely nothing. And something inside Celeste, the part of her that had spent 7 years loving a man who wore his power like armor and his tenderness like a classified document, went quiet in a way she knew was permanent. She walked to the table. She picked up the folder. She opened it and found the divorce papers, 23 pages, already bookmarked at the signature line. The settlement was indeed generous, the kind of generous that was designed to make refusal seem irrational. She could see Elena's hand in the specificity of it, the practicality, the efficiency, the complete absence of anything that acknowledged love had ever existed in this marriage. She reached into her handbag for a pen. Her fingers brushed the white envelope, the small black and white photograph inside it, the steady, unmistakable heartbeat she had seen flickering on a monitor less than 2 hours ago. She thought about saying it, placing the photograph on the table between all of them and watching the room shift, making Roman see what his silence was costing him before the cost became permanent. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to uncap the pen. Then she signed. Page after page, line after line, her signature small and controlled and giving nothing away. She could feel Elena watching her with something that might have been satisfaction or might have been relief. She had stopped caring which. She could feel Roman standing at the edge of her peripheral vision, still not moving, still not speaking. A man made of stone in a room full of everything he was throwing away without even knowing it. When she finished, she capped the pen and placed it neatly on top of the papers. She closed the folder. She picked up her handbag and smoothed the strap over her shoulder. "Celeste," Roman said her name. Just once, just that, with something in his voice she couldn't identify because she was already done interpreting him. She looked at him. She let herself look for one full second, memorizing the line of his face the way you memorize the details of a place you know you'll never return to. Then she walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and stepped inside when the doors opened. They closed behind her. In the descending silence of the elevator shaft, 17 floors and counting, Celeste reached into her handbag and took out the white envelope. She held it in both hands. She looked at the folded edges, the small rectangle of paper that held the image of a heartbeat that Roman Dragunov did not know existed and might never know existed. She turned the photograph over. On the blank white back of it, with the same pen she'd used to dissolve her marriage, she wrote 7 words. "If you ever choose us, find us." She folded it again, put it back in the envelope, back in the handbag. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Marcus was back at his post, and he nodded to her as she walked past, and she nodded back, and she walked through the glass doors into the blinding May afternoon, carrying nothing except the clothes on her back, the money in her wallet, and the smallest, most devastating secret the Dragunov family had ever failed to know. She did not cry. Not on the sidewalk, not in the cab she hailed 3 blocks east, not in the airport 2 hours later, where she bought a one-way ticket to Chicago with a credit card registered in her maiden name, Vaughn, not Dragunov, a card she had kept quietly active for reasons she had told herself were practical and now understood were prophetic. She sat at the gate and watched planes move on the tarmac and placed one hand flat against her stomach, very still, the way you place your hand on something you are afraid of losing. She was 31 years old. She had just signed away her marriage. She was 14 weeks pregnant with a child whose father had stood 12 feet away from her and chosen silence. And in the back of her mind, already assembling itself with the cold clarity that grief sometimes produces, was the first thought of what came next. Not revenge. Not yet. Something quieter than that. Something more patient. She had a grandfather she hadn't spoken to in 7 years. A man who had built a dynasty from almost nothing and had tried repeatedly to warn her about the world she was walking into when she chose Roman Dragunov. She had stopped returning his calls somewhere around year 2 of the marriage, when Roman's orbit had become her entire sky, and everything outside it had seemed distant and unnecessary. She reached for her phone, scrolled to a contact she hadn't touched in years, stared at the name, Nathaniel Blackwood, for a long time. The boarding announcement came over the speakers. Celeste stood up, shouldered her bag, and joined the line of people moving toward the gate. She did not look back at the terminal. She did not look at her phone again. But she did not delete the contact either. The plane lifted off into a sky the color of lead, and below her the city that had held her life for 7 years shrank and dissolved into geometry. Streets and bridges and the sharp glint of the river, until it was too small to see, and then gone altogether. And somewhere in a penthouse on the Upper East Side, the divorce papers sat unsigned by the man who should have fought for her. And in a storage closet on the building's 14th floor, in a box of things that wouldn't be opened for 6 years, lay a white envelope with 7 words on the back of a photograph. A photograph of a heartbeat that was already, quietly, stubbornly, making its way into the world without him. What Celeste didn't know as that plane cut north through darkening clouds, what she couldn't possibly know, was that the woman she had found in her living room was not simply a rival. Isabella Moretti had been inside the Dragunov operation for over a year, and the man who had introduced her to Roman, the man Roman trusted above everyone else, was already making arrangements to ensure that Roman Dragunov would never be powerful enough to look for his missing wife, or the child he didn't know he'd abandoned. The Chicago apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building that had probably been respectable once, back when the neighborhood still had opinions about itself. Now it was the kind of place where the radiator knocked at 3 in the morning and the hallway smelled like other people's cooking, and nobody asked questions about who you were or where you'd come from. Celeste had paid 3 months up front in cash, given a name the landlord didn't bother to verify, and carried her single bag up the stairs without asking for help. She stood in the center of the empty living room for a long time after the landlord left. Brown carpet, one window facing a brick wall, a kitchen the size of a generous closet. The whole apartment could fit inside the Dragunov penthouse's master bathroom with room to spare. She set her bag on the floor. She sat down next to it, her back against the wall, and put both hands flat on her stomach the way she had at the airport, that careful gesture that was already becoming involuntary, a reflex she hadn't asked for. The city moved outside the window, pigeons on the opposite ledge, a siren somewhere below. The ordinary noise of a world that did not know or care that Celeste Dragunov had ceased to exist today, and Celeste Vaughn had come back from a 7-year absence like something that had been buried in shallow ground. She gave herself that night, just that one night, to sit on brown carpet in an empty room and feel the full weight of what had happened. She didn't unpack, she didn't eat. She sat with her back against the wall and her hands on her stomach, and she breathed, in and out, deliberately, the way the breathing instructor at the fertility clinic had taught her during one of the earlier rounds of treatment, a technique designed for managing grief, disguised as a technique for managing stress. In the morning, she called Nathaniel Blackwood. He picked up on the second ring. He didn't say he was surprised to hear from her, and she didn't apologize for the 7 years of silence, and neither of them wasted time on the kind of preamble that softens the edges of hard conversations. That was one of the things she had always respected about him. He had no patience for softening. "I need a meeting," she said. "When?" "Today, if you can." A pause. Not hesitation, calculation. She recognized the difference because she'd spent 7 years watching Roman do it. Union Station, the coffee place on the north end of the Great Hall, noon. He was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, wearing a suit that probably cost as much as her apartment's rent, but was cut plainly enough that most people wouldn't clock it. Nathaniel Blackwood was 71 years old, built like someone who had been larger once and aged into economy, with white hair and hands that still looked like they could do serious damage if he asked them to. He watched her cross the hall without standing up, without smiling, without any of the theater that reunion usually demands. She sat down across from him. He looked at her face for a moment, then at her hands on the table, then back at her face. "You left him," he said. "He left me first," she said. "I just made it official." Nathaniel picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. "And now? I need capital, not a loan, an investment. I want back in. To Blackwood, to the fund, whatever's still operational. I know I walked away. I know what that cost." She stopped, held his gaze. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to work." He was quiet for long enough that the ambient noise of the station filled the space between them. The echo of footsteps on marble, the distant announcement of a departure, the low percussion of a city that didn't pause for personal reckonings. "You're pregnant," he said. She hadn't told him. She was barely showing. But Nathaniel Blackwood had made 40 years of professional decisions based on reading things that weren't explicitly stated, and apparently that skill extended to family. "Yes," she said. "His. Yes." "Does he know?" "No." She said it without inflection. Final. A door she was not inviting him to push open. Nathaniel looked at her for another long moment, then nodded once. A small, precise movement that contained everything he'd decided not to say about Roman Dragunov and everything she'd decided not to explain. He reached into his jacket and placed a business card on the table between them. His personal attorney. "Be in his office at 8 tomorrow morning," Nathaniel said. "I'll call ahead. The restructuring documents for Blackwood Capital will be ready." He stood up, picked up his coat, and then paused, one hand on the back of his chair. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you have something to say that might come out wrong regardless of how you arrange it. "I told you," he said quietly, 7 years ago. "I told you that world doesn't let people out clean." "I know." "You look clean to me," he said, and that was all. He walked away across the marble floor, an old man with straight shoulders and heavy hands, and Celeste watched him go and felt something that was not warmth exactly, but was adjacent to it. Something solid, something that could hold weight. She had one ally, one table to build from, and a child arriving in approximately 25 weeks who was going to need a world that didn't depend on the Dragunov name for its stability. She ordered coffee she didn't drink and sat in the great hall of Union Station for another hour, making a list on her phone. Not a plan, not yet, just a list of everything she knew and everything she would need to learn. Then she went back to the brown carpet apartment and slept for 11 hours straight, which was the most she had slept in years. And in the morning, she put on the best clothes she had with her and walked into a lawyer's office and began the work of becoming someone the world hadn't met yet. Meanwhile, in New York, Roman Dragunov was doing what he always did when he was losing something. He buried himself in the thing he still controlled. The week after the divorce papers were signed, he authorized 3 new acquisitions, restructured the leadership of 2 shipping operations along the eastern seaboard, and spent 14 hours in a conference room with Moretti family lawyers hammering out the terms of an alliance that his own consigliere, a man named Luca Caretti, had described as the most strategically significant consolidation the Dragunov organization had made in a decade. Roman sat at the head of the table and negotiated with the particular cold precision that had made him impossible to outmaneuver for 20 years. And when the meeting ended and the Moretti representative shook his hand and Isabella Moretti smiled at him from across the table with those composed dark eyes, he felt nothing except the dull satisfaction of a problem efficiently resolved. He did not think about Celeste. He told himself this, specifically, with the same discipline he applied to everything else. He did not think about her. He did not go back to the penthouse for the first 2 weeks. He stayed in the office apartment on the 52nd floor, and when he finally returned, he walked through the rooms methodically and noted what was missing. Some books, 1 photograph, the small blue ceramic bowl she'd kept on the kitchen counter for fruit that was always slightly too ripe. She had taken almost nothing, which somehow made the absence worse than a ransacked apartment would have been. Ransacked apartments told you someone was angry. Empty spaces on shelves just said, "I was here. Now I'm not. And I didn't need your things to prove it." He did not think about that either. Luca Caretti was 54 years old and had been Roman's right hand for 11 years. A compact, meticulous man who spoke softly and remembered everything and had never once in 11 years given Roman reason to doubt him. He had handled the Moretti introduction. He had helped structure the alliance terms. He had been, Roman reflected during one of the long nights in the office apartment, indispensable in a way that most people who worked for Roman aspired to be, but very few achieved. Luca knew when to speak and when to be silent. He knew which information to bring to Roman and which to contain. He was, in Roman's estimation, the closest thing he had to an operational twin. What Roman did not know, what he had no mechanism to know yet, was that Luca Coretti had been making separate calls for the past 14 months. Calls that went to a private number registered in the name of a Delaware shell company. Calls that lasted between 6 and 20 minutes. Calls that happened within hours of every significant decision Roman had made regarding the Moretti alliance. The number belonged to Domenico Moretti's personal counsel, and the information moving through it was not strategic consultation. It was a slow, meticulous transfer of Dragunov operational intelligence into Moretti hands, conducted with the patience and precision of someone who had decided, long before any of this began, exactly how the next chapter of this story was going to end. Isabella Moretti had not simply shown up in that penthouse by accident, she had been placed there. In Chicago, Celeste didn't know any of this. She was 31 years old, 17 weeks pregnant, sleeping on a mattress on the floor of an apartment with brown carpet, waking at 5 in the morning because the baby had decided that 4 to 6 a.m. was the appropriate window for aggressive activity, and spending the hours between first light and the start of business reviewing every financial document Blackwood Capital's attorney had provided her. The fund was in bad shape. Not catastrophically, Nathaniel had kept it from collapse through conservative management and strategic patience. But the years of Celeste's absence had cost it the kind of aggressive growth that required someone willing to take calibrated risks. It was a cautious, aging portfolio, and it needed surgery. She performed it methodically. Week by week, through the summer, she restructured positions, identified emerging markets that the fund's existing managers had avoided for reasons that looked like prudence, but were actually fear, and began building relationships with 3 institutional investors who had been on Blackwood Capital's periphery for years without ever committing. She took meetings by phone and by video, and when she took them in person, she wore blazers that hid the growing curve of her abdomen until she decided, somewhere around month 6, that she was done hiding it. She walked into a meeting with a pension fund manager in downtown Chicago at 7 months pregnant and sat across from him and outlined a 3-year growth strategy with the same flat precision she might have used to discuss the weather. And when the meeting ended, he shook her hand and said, "You're either the most composed person I've ever met or the most dangerous." She'd said, "Probably both," and he'd laughed, and 2 weeks later his fund committed $40 million to Blackwood Capital. She named her son Eli. He arrived 11 days early in October during a rainstorm in a hospital where nobody knew her married name, and the birth certificate read Eli Blackwood Vaughn. She was in labor for 9 hours, and she did not call anyone until it was over, and then she called Nathaniel, who drove himself to the hospital and sat in the chair beside her bed and held the baby with the careful, unpracticed hands of a man who had not held an infant in 30 years and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "He has your eyes." Celeste looked at her son. His eyes were dark, nearly black, and she knew what Nathaniel was not saying, that the eyes were not hers at all, that they were the same eyes she had spent 7 years studying across dinner tables and boardroom tables, and in the particular dark of 3 in the morning when Roman Dragunov couldn't sleep and sat in the kitchen with a glass of water and the look of a man carrying something heavy in a place hands couldn't reach. "Yes," she said simply, and let Nathaniel believe what he wanted to believe. Back in New York, the first crack appeared 6 weeks after Eli was born. It appeared in the form of a discrepancy in a shipping account, a small one, the kind that accountants are trained to flag and then usually attribute to rounding or transfer delays. Roman's financial controller, a meticulous woman named Diane Park, had flagged it in a Tuesday morning report buried on the 4th page, marked in yellow, notation reading "Recommend verification." In the old days, Roman would have caught it. In the old days, before the Moretti Alliance restructured half the organization's accounting architecture, he would have had the institutional knowledge to recognize immediately which column the number should have appeared in and which column it was actually in, and why those 2 columns being different was a problem. But the accounting architecture had been redesigned by Luca, and Roman didn't catch it. Luca did. He caught it before Roman saw it, called Diane Park directly, and told her the discrepancy was a transfer timing issue related to the Moretti consolidation and that she should reclassify it accordingly. Diane Park did as she was told. She was not a person who questioned Luca Coretti. Nobody in the organization questioned Luca Coretti, which was exactly how he needed it to stay for approximately 8 more months. The Moretti Alliance, publicly, was producing results. The combined organization had expanded into 3 new port cities, and the luxury hotel network that Roman had always kept separate from the criminal operations, the legitimate face of the Dragunov Empire, was showing revenue growth that legitimate analysts attributed to smart positioning. Isabella had taken a formal role as a strategic consultant, operating from a satellite office that Luca had arranged on the 38th floor of the Dragunov Group's main building. And she moved through the company with the ease of someone who understood its architecture because she'd been given access to its blueprints. Roman worked. He worked the way he always worked, which was to say relentlessly and with a tunnel vision that had always been his greatest strength and was now quietly becoming the instrument of his own undoing. He was at his desk at 6 in the morning and rarely left before midnight. He ate at the desk. He slept on the office couch twice a week. He negotiated, he authorized, he approved. Elena visited once a month over dinner and spoke about the Moretti Alliance with something that wasn't quite pride, but was structurally similar to it. The satisfaction of a woman who had pushed toward a particular outcome and watched it arrive. She never mentioned Celeste. Roman never mentioned Celeste. In the careful silence between them on the subject of his former wife, Roman sometimes felt something he refused to name moving around the edges, the way you feel the presence of a room you can't see through a wall. He didn't go looking for it. Then one night in February, Eli was 4 months old in Chicago, though Roman didn't know a 4-month-old named Eli existed. Luca made an error. It was a small error. The kind that only happens when someone has been operating at high pressure for too long and allows a moment of confidence to overtake caution. He authorized a transfer of funds from a Dragunov holding account to a Moretti-controlled LLC, a transfer that should have been structured through 3 intermediate entities to be invisible, and instead was structured through 2. 1 layer short. A ghost of a trail that Diane Park would never have caught, that most forensic accountants would have needed weeks to find, but that Roman Dragunov, Roman specifically, with his particular obsessive knowledge of his own financial architecture, would recognize in approximately 45 seconds if the account statement ever crossed his desk. Luca had kept that particular account statement from crossing Roman's desk for 8 months. But Diane Park submitted her quarterly consolidated report directly to Roman's private email. It was protocol, old protocol, from before the restructuring, from back when Roman had personally designed the reporting chain. And Luca, who had redesigned almost everything, had not redesigned that. An oversight. A single oversight in 14 months of meticulous, essentially flawless operation. Roman was alone in the office at 11:30 on a Wednesday night when the report came through. He read it the way he read everything, quickly, categorically, flagging discrepancies before he'd even consciously processed what he was flagging. He got to page 7. He stopped. He read the relevant line 3 times. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his office. The city spread below the windows on 3 sides, New York in February, cold light and cold glass, and did not move for a long time. He wasn't angry. That was the thing that would have surprised anyone who had ever seen Roman Dragunov angry. He wasn't angry yet. What he was, in that moment, was very, very still, in the way of a man who has just recognized that the building he is sitting inside has been structurally compromised and is now calculating with absolute precision exactly how much time he has before the collapse. He picked up his phone. Not to call Luca, not yet. He called Diane Park. She answered on the 4th ring, her voice carrying the rough edge of someone pulled from sleep. Mr. Dragunov? The Consolidated Quarterly, page 7, the Meridian Holdings transfer. Walk me through the authorization chain. A pause. The sound of movement, papers, or a keyboard. Then, the authorization came through Mr. Coretti's office, classified as a structural transfer under the Moretti consolidation protocols. Who signed the secondary authorization? Another pause. Longer this time. There wasn't one. The system flagged it for secondary review, but she stopped. But what? Mr. Coretti told me the secondary authorization requirement had been suspended for Moretti-related transfers. He said you'd approved the protocol change in November. Her voice was careful now, very careful, the voice of a woman who was beginning to understand what she was standing in the middle of. "There's a memo in the system, under your signature. Send it to me." He had the memo in 40 seconds. He read it in 10. He had never seen it before in his life. His signature was on the bottom of it, and he had never signed it, and it was one of the most perfect forgeries he had ever seen, which told him something important about how long this had been in preparation, about how much patience had gone into building this particular trap around him. He set the phone down on the desk. He thought about Luca. 11 years. 11 years of 6 a.m. briefings and late-night calls, and the particular shorthand of two people who have operated in the same dangerous world long enough to finish each other's sentences. He thought about the introduction to Domenico Moretti, who had arranged that, whose idea that had been, the memory coming back now with the cold clarity of something seen correctly for the first time. He thought about Isabella standing in his living room with her hand on his chest, and he thought about the timing of that, and the elevator doors closing behind Celeste, and the papers on the table, and how efficiently and quickly everything had moved from that point forward. He thought about how a man dismantles an empire. You don't attack it from outside. You get someone inside to hand you the keys. Roman stood up from his desk. He walked to the window and stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the city, and his face was very still and very cold, and anyone who knew him well enough to read it would have recognized that expression and understood immediately that something had shifted past the point where rage was useful. He was not going to call Luca. Not tonight. He was going to do something that Roman Dragunov almost never did. Something that ran against every instinct that had kept him alive for 20 years at the top of a world that ate men for inefficiency. He was going to wait. He was going to be patient and quiet and let Luca believe that the forgery had worked and the trail was invisible, and the next phase of whatever had been planned could proceed on schedule. And in that window of false security, Roman was going to map every single connection, every transfer, every shell company, every call, until he had not just the crime but the complete architecture of it, every name, every account, every layer, because when Roman Dragunov finally moved, he needed it to be. He waited 6 weeks. 6 weeks of sitting across from Luca Coretti in morning briefings, watching the man's mouth move, watching his hands arrange papers and his eyes track across screens and his face produce the exact same expressions it had produced for 11 years. Measured, competent, loyal, and feeling something cold and structural settle into Roman's chest like concrete curing in a form. He waited 6 weeks, and in those 6 weeks he said nothing. Not a word. Not a look that ran a degree hotter than usual. Nothing that would disturb the surface of the thing and alert whatever was swimming below it. He was also, in those 6 weeks, doing the most meticulous work of his professional life. He had a man, not Luca's man, not anyone who had come into the organization during the Moretti restructuring, but an older operator named Vincent Chen, who had worked Dragunov Financial Security for 15 years and owed Roman a debt that predated everything Isabella and Luca had touched. And he put Vincent on it quietly, with a list of parameters and a simple instruction. Find me the shape of it. Not just the transfer. The whole shape. Vincent delivered in installments. Not reports. Roman didn't want documents. But conversations, in person, in the parking structure of a hotel in Midtown that Roman drove himself to at varying hours, alone, without telling anyone where he was going. Vincent would sit in the passenger seat of Roman's car and talk, and Roman would listen, and neither of them wrote anything down. The shape that emerged over those 6 weeks was worse than Roman had anticipated, not more complex. Complexity he'd expected. Worse in the way that only becomes apparent when you can finally see the whole thing at once. When the individual pieces that each looked like simple corruption arrange themselves into something that reveals intent, reveals planning, reveals that what you thought was an alliance being built around you was actually a cage. Luca had been systematically moving Dragunov assets into Moretti-controlled structures for 14 months, not stealing them outright. That would have been detectable, recoverable. Instead, he was reclassifying them, redefining their ownership through a sequence of paper transactions that were individually legitimate and collectively a transfer of control so thorough that by the time Roman had found the first discrepancy, approximately 40% of what he believed he owned was already, legally, gone. The Moretti family would not need to take the Dragunov organization by force. By the time they were finished, they would simply inform Roman that he was a minority stakeholder in his own empire, with documentation to prove it, and invite him to accept a management role at their discretion or walk away with whatever fraction remained. Roman sat with this information for 2 days. Then he drove to Midtown for a final conversation with Vincent and asked one more question. "Isabella," he said, "how long?" Vincent looked at the dashboard. "The first contact with Luca we can document is 22 months ago." He paused. "Before you brought her in." Roman nodded slowly. "She didn't come to you," Vincent said. "Luca placed her. He built the introduction. He positioned the Moretti alliance as the opportunity. He managed your mother's enthusiasm for the arrangement." Another pause. "The penthouse. The day your wife—" He stopped. Recalibrated. "That was staged. We found texts between Luca and Isabella from the morning of. She was already there when he told her you'd be working from home. She knew your wife would come back early because Luca had confirmed the fertility clinic appointment through your household calendar." The car was very quiet. "Your wife's departure was part of the plan," Vincent said. He said it the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis, flat, because the only alternative is false comfort, and false comfort helps nobody. A wife with Blackwood family connections who was paying attention represented a risk to the asset transfer timeline. With her gone, "Enough," Roman said. Vincent went quiet. Roman stared through the windshield at a concrete pillar and the fluorescent stripe of parking structure lighting and felt something he did not have an adequate word for. Not anger. He'd been angry before, many times, and anger had a heat to it, a direction, something that moved. This was different. This was the sensation of a man who has just been shown, comprehensively, that the most significant choices of his last 2 years, the alliance, the marriage's end, his mother's approval, his own silence while Celeste walked to the elevator, had not been his choices at all. They had been arranged. He had been moved across a board by people he trusted while believing he was the one doing the moving. He had spent 20 years being the most dangerous man in the room, and he had not noticed when the room changed around him. "Where's Luca tonight?" Roman asked. "Office. He usually stays until 10. Roman started the car. He drove back to the building and rode the elevator to the 52nd floor and walked past the assistant's empty desk and pushed open the door to the war room where Luca was standing at the glass wall with a phone to his ear, looking out at the city the way Roman had stood at his own window 6 weeks ago. And when Luca heard the door, he turned and his face produced its usual expression, measured, attentive, ready. And Roman closed the door behind him and stood inside it and looked at Luca Coretti for a long time without speaking. The phone call ended. Luca lowered the phone. "You're in late," Luca said. "Sit down," Roman said. Something crossed Luca's face. Too fast to name. He pulled out a chair and sat, placing his phone face down on the table in a gesture that looked casual and wasn't. Roman didn't sit. He walked to the far end of the table and stood with both hands resting on the back of a chair and looked at Luca across the length of it. "Meridian Holdings," Roman said. Luca's expression didn't change. "The Moretti consolidation transfer. Diane flagged it. I explained to her—" "You explained to her that I'd suspended the secondary authorization requirement." Roman's voice was completely level. That was the thing about the coldest conversations. They happened in a register that most people mistook for calm. "You showed her a memo with my signature." "That's correct. You approved that protocol change in November. I never signed that memo, Luca." The room was very quiet. Luca held Roman's gaze for 3 full seconds. Roman counted them. Then something shifted in Luca's face. Not collapse, not panic, but a kind of recalibration. The adjustment of a very intelligent man who has just had a door close in front of him and is immediately, quietly, looking for the window. "Roman," he started. "Don't." Roman's voice didn't rise. If anything, it got quieter. "Don't construct something. Don't give me a version. I have the transfers. I have the LLC structure. I have 22 months of contact logs between you and Moretti Council." He watched Luca process that. "I have the texts from the morning my wife came home." That one landed differently. He saw it in the slight change in Luca's breathing, the almost imperceptible tension in the jaw. "So," Roman said, "I'm not asking you to explain. I'm asking you one question, and I want the honest answer because it is the only thing I'm going to give you credit for in whatever happens next." He came around the end of the table slowly, not threateningly, just removing the distance. He stopped 4 feet from Luca's chair and looked down at him. "My mother, how much does she know?" Luca looked up at him. "How much?" Roman said again, very softly. Luca pressed his mouth together, looked at the table, then looked back up. "She didn't know the mechanics," he said, "but she knew the outcome they wanted. The Morettis discussed it with her 2 years ago. They told her the alliance would be stronger without Celeste in the picture. He stopped, reorganized. She agreed that a clean departure would be better than a contested one. She didn't ask about the method." Roman did not move. "She believed it was the right outcome," Luca said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like he believed Roman needed it softened, needed the edge taken off, which showed that even now, cornered, Luca was still managing him. "She wanted the family secured. The Morettis offered security. She wanted Celeste gone." Luca said nothing. "She knew Celeste would be removed and she didn't ask how," Roman said. "And she sat at my dinner table for 2 years and told me I'd made the right decision." "Roman, get out of my building." Luca blinked. "If I walk out of here without what?" Roman said. "Without the agreement that protects you?" "There is no agreement. There is no version of what you've done that I protect you from." He stepped back. "You have until I reach my office to be out of this building. After that, I make calls you won't recover from." Luca stood up. He picked up his phone and his jacket with the careful movements of a man who knows that anything rushed will look like fear, and anything slow will look like defiance, and there is no right speed for this particular exit. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and didn't turn around. "The Morettis won't stop because you found the transfers," Luca said. "You've built a wall with missing bricks, Roman. You just found out about the bricks. The wall's already compromised." He paused. "Domenico has people in 3 federal agencies. Whatever you think you're going to do next, he already has a response ready." Then he walked out. Roman stood in the war room alone. He stayed there for a long time. Then he went to his office, sat at his desk, and called his mother. Elena picked up immediately, the way she always did when Roman called after 10 at night. She'd been a light sleeper since his father died, and a late call from Roman carried the particular frequency of something she needed to be awake for. "Roman," her voice was careful. "2 years ago," Roman said, "when Luca first brought you the Moretti proposal, what exactly did Domenico tell you about Celeste?" A pause. Long enough. He had his answer before she spoke. "He said she was a liability," Elena said finally. Her voice had shifted into the register she used when she was constructing something, not lying exactly, but building a frame around the truth that made it look like a different shape. Her grandfather's connections, the Blackwood name, Domenico felt it complicated the consolidation, that she would have leverage to interfere, so you helped them remove her? "I helped you make a decision you were too stubborn to make on your own." The frame dropped. The register underneath it was harder, older, the voice of a woman who has never doubted that her management of other people was in their best interests. "She was never right for this world, Roman. You knew it. I made it easier for you to accept what you already knew. She was pregnant," Roman said. The silence that followed was different from every other silence in the conversation. It had a texture to it. "What?" Elena said. And he heard it. The thing he'd been listening for. Not performed shock, something genuine. Something that arrived in her voice like a fist through glass, sudden and jagged. Whatever she had agreed to, whatever she had known about Luca's methods, she had not known this. She had not known about a pregnancy, which told Roman something about his mother that was true and terrible, and complicated the architecture of his anger in a way he did not have time to untangle tonight. "She was 14 weeks pregnant when she signed the divorce papers," Roman said. "She walked out of that penthouse carrying my child, and none of you knew because none of you asked, and none of you—" He stopped. His voice had shifted. He pulled it back. "I need to know where she is." "Roman, I need to know where she is," he said again, and something in his voice ended the conversation's other possibilities, closed every room except the one they were standing in. If you know anything, anything she mentioned, anywhere she spoke of going, anyone she was still in contact with, anything. I didn't know, Elena said. Her voice was different now, smaller, the architecture of her certainty visibly cracking under a weight she hadn't anticipated. Roman, I swear to you, I didn't know she was... I know, he said. And he did. That much he believed. I need to find her. He ended the call. He sat for a moment looking at his desk. Then he opened his laptop and typed 2 words into a private search interface. Celeste Vaughn. The results took 4 seconds to populate. What came back stopped him completely. She was not hiding. That was the first thing. He had been operating under the assumption, in the back of his mind where he'd refused to look directly at it, that she was somewhere quiet and contained, managed, careful, protected by anonymity. It had never occurred to him, not once in however many times he'd not thought about her in the past 2 years, that she might have done anything except survive. Celeste Vaughn, formerly of Blackwood Capital, currently CEO of Blackwood Global Holdings, had been named to the Forbes list of America's wealthiest executives 8 months ago. She had spoken at the World Economic Forum in February. She was the subject of a profile in the Financial Times from 6 weeks prior, in which she was described as the most consequential American investor of the past 3 years. The company she had rebuilt from the ruins of her grandfather's fund now managed assets exceeding $12 billion. Roman stared at the screen. He scrolled. There was a photograph from a gala in Chicago, dated 18 months ago. Celeste in a dark suit, her hair shorter than he remembered, standing with a group of institutional investors in the atrium of what appeared to be a recently opened building. He searched for the right word and found one he hadn't used in a long time. Formidable. Not the woman he had watched sign divorce papers, not the woman he'd allowed to walk to his elevator while he stood with his hands at his sides. Something else. Something that had been inside her all along and had apparently required his failure to fully emerge. He kept scrolling. And then he found it. A Society column item from a Chicago publication dated 2 years ago, brief and incidental, the kind of item that ran in the small print section between gallery openings and restaurant news. A mention of Celeste Vaughn being seen at a fundraiser for a children's literacy organization, described as attending with her infant son. Roman stopped scrolling. He read the sentence again, twice, 3 times. He pushed back from the desk and stood up and walked to the window and stood there the way he'd stood many times before, but this time the city below him looked different, smaller, stranger, a model of a city rather than a city, something a hand could cover entirely. His son was 2 years old. His son had been alive for 2 years, and he had not known. His son had been alive for 2 years because his wife, his former wife, had walked out of his penthouse one May morning with the knowledge of his existence folded in a white envelope in her handbag, and Roman had let her go, had stood 12 feet away and said nothing, and the child had been born and named and was now presumably walking and talking and existing fully in the world under a name that was not Dragunov, in a city Roman had never looked for him in a life that had been built entirely without him. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window. He didn't close his eyes. He looked at the city and made himself look at it because he felt, in this moment, that looking away from anything was a luxury he had revoked his own right to the day he stood silent while Celeste walked to his elevator. He had found, in the past 6 weeks, that Luca Coretti had spent 14 months stealing his empire. He had found tonight that his mother had participated in the removal of his wife. And he had found, in a 3-line Society column item, that he had a son who was 2 years old and had never heard his name. He thought he had known the dimensions of what had been taken from him. He had been wrong. He had been wrong about the dimensions in the way that a man is wrong about the size of a wound when he's still in shock, the full extent only visible once the shock wears off and the damage is too large to refuse to see. He turned away from the window. He sat back at his desk. He opened a new document, and for the first time in his professional life, Roman Dragunov began writing down everything he knew, in sequence, in detail, all of it, not because he had someone to give it to yet, but because the act of writing it down was the first step in the process of deciding what to do with an empire that was already half gone, a criminal organization with federal informants in its operation, and a life that had just revealed itself to be almost entirely different from the one he believed he'd been living. He wrote until 4 in the morning. At 4, he stopped. He saved the document to an encrypted drive that connected to nothing, that existed only on hardware he kept in a safe in his apartment. He sat back. And then his phone rang. The number was blocked. He almost didn't answer. Then something, instinct, the particular frequency of a blocked call at 4 in the morning after a night like this one, made him pick up. Mr. Dragunov, a voice he didn't recognize. Measured, professional, the voice of someone accustomed to delivering information rather than receiving it. My name isn't important. What's important is that you listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because you have approximately 48 hours before Domenico Moretti files the transfer documentation in the Delaware courts, at which point every restructuring we've discussed tonight becomes legally permanent. Roman's hand tightened on the phone. Who is this? Someone who has been watching what Luca and the Morettis have built for a long time, the voice said. Someone who has also been watching Blackwood Global Holdings for the past 18 months. Someone who believes the most efficient way to dismantle the Moretti operation is through a coordinated financial strike rather than a jurisdictional one. A pause. Someone who has already made contact with Ms. Vaughn. The room stopped. She knows who I am, the voice continued. She doesn't know I'm calling you. Those two facts are going to create a problem in the next 48 hours that only one of you can resolve, but not separately, not without the other one in the room. Another pause. Ms. Vaughn has the financial architecture to freeze every Moretti-controlled asset in 4 countries simultaneously. You have the operational knowledge of every criminal structure they've absorbed from your organization. Together, that's enough to end this. The voice was very precise now, very clean. Separately, in 48 hours, Domenico Moretti owns your company on paper, and Ms. Vaughn's funds will be the next target because she has become large enough to matter. Roman stood up from the desk. I'm going to send you an address, the voice said. Be there at noon tomorrow, alone, no security. A beat. Ms. Vaughn will be there. Whether she speaks to you is her choice, but she will be there, and you need to be there too, because the alternative, for both of you, and for the child you haven't met yet, is that Domenico Moretti wins and none of this ever gets corrected. The call ended. Roman stood in his office at 4 in the morning with a dead phone in his hand and the city going gray at the edges outside his window, the first colorless light of a February dawn beginning to separate the skyline from the sky. He thought about the address that would come to his phone in the next few minutes, and the woman who would be at that address, and the son he had not met, and the 48 hours standing between him and the permanent legal dissolution of everything he had spent 20 years building, and the simple, devastating fact that the only person in the world who might be willing to help him, and who had every conceivable reason not to, was the woman he had stood 12 feet away from and chosen silence over. His phone buzzed. An address. Chicago. Roman Dragunov looked at it for a long time. Then he walked to his safe, retrieved the encrypted drive, pocketed it, and went to pack a bag, because there was nothing left in New York that was still his, and the only move remaining to a man who had lost his empire, his family, and the last 2 years of his own son's life was to walk toward the one person he had no right to ask anything of, and ask anyway, and accept whatever she decided to do with him when he got there. He was on a 6 a.m. flight to Chicago when his office phone rang with the news that Luca Coretti had been found in his car in a parking structure in Midtown, engine running, and was being taken to Bellevue in critical condition, not by his own hand, the detective who called said, though they were still determining the circumstances. And Roman listened to this information from 30,000 feet in the air and understood, with a clarity that felt like cold water, that Domenico Moretti was already eliminating the people who knew too much about the architecture of what had been built, and that Luca had outlived his usefulness to the people he had betrayed Roman to serve, and that Roman himself was almost certainly next on a list that had been written before any of this began. He looked out the window at the dark above the clouds. Below him, somewhere in a city he hadn't visited since before his marriage, a woman who had rebuilt an empire from nothing was waking up to a morning she didn't know was going to change everything, And a 2-year-old boy who looked like Roman's childhood photographs was probably asking for breakfast in a voice Roman had never heard. And the 48-hour clock that Domenico Moretti had set in motion was running, indifferent to guilt or grief or the complicated mathematics of what a man owes the people he failed when he still had the chance to do otherwise. The plane broke through the cloud cover into gray Midwestern light. Roman pressed his hands flat on his knees and breathed. He had 42 hours. And he had no idea, none at all, whether Celeste Vaughn would look at him when he walked through that door, or whether she would simply stand across a room from him the way he had once stood across a room from her, and choose the same silence he had chosen, and let him understand finally and completely exactly what that silence cost. The address was a converted warehouse in the West Loop, the kind of building that had been a meatpacking facility in a previous life and now housed a financial consulting firm on its upper floors with the kind of anonymous discretion that money purchases in cities where money is the primary language. Roman's cab pulled up at 11:53, and he sat in the back for a moment looking at the building's facade. Raw brick, steel-framed windows, a single unmarked door at street level, before getting out. The air was cold. February in Chicago had a particular quality of cold, not just temperature but weight, a cold that pressed against exposed skin with something that felt almost personal. Roman had not slept. He had spent the flight reviewing the encrypted drive, and the 6 hours since landing in a hotel room reviewing it again, and now he stood on a sidewalk in a city he hadn't visited in years with a drive in his coat pocket and 40 hours left on a clock he couldn't pause. He went through the unmarked door. A man he didn't recognize was inside, broad-shouldered and quiet, who looked at Roman's face and then stepped aside without speaking. Roman took the stairs. 3rd floor. A hallway, 2 doors, the second one open. He stopped in the doorway. The room was a conference space that had been recently and minimally furnished. A table, chairs, a whiteboard on one wall covered in financial notations in 2 different handwritings. Windows on the north side let in gray winter light. There were 3 people already in the room. A man Roman didn't know, 50s, gray suit, standing near the whiteboard with his arms crossed. The voice from the phone, Roman decided immediately. Something in the posture matched the precision of the delivery. A woman in her 40s, dark-suited with a laptop open in front of her and the focused expression of someone who had been working since before dawn. And Celeste. She was standing at the far window with a cup of coffee, her back 3/4 to the door, looking at the street below. She wore a dark blazer over a white shirt, her hair shorter than the photograph he'd found, cropped close, almost severe, which on her looked not severe at all but deliberate. The choice of a person who had edited everything unnecessary out of their presentation and kept only what was functional. She was thinner than he remembered. Or not thinner, leaner. The distinction mattered. Thinner suggested loss. This was something else. This was a body that had been put through significant demands and had adapted to meet them, the way metal changes under sustained pressure. She did not turn when he came in. The man in the gray suit spoke first. "Mr. Dragunov, thank you for coming." He gestured to the table. "We have limited time, so I'd prefer to move quickly. My name is Warren Aldrich. I'm a senior investigative consultant who has been building a case against the Moretti organization for 26 months. What the Morettis did to your company is relevant to that case, but it's not the entirety of it." He moved to the whiteboard. "Ms. Vaughn's financial network became relevant to my work approximately 10 months ago, when Moretti-controlled assets began moving through offshore structures that intersected with Blackwood Global's institutional partners. She and I have been in communication for 6 months. Roman looked at Celeste's back. She hadn't moved. "The Delaware filing," Roman said. 48 hours. "Correct. Once those transfer documents are filed and legally recorded, the asset restructuring becomes essentially irreversible through conventional legal channels." Aldrich's voice was the same as the phone, clean, constructed for information delivery. "However, there is an unconventional channel. Ms. Vaughn." Celeste turned around. Roman had prepared himself, in the cab and the hotel room and the flight, for what it would feel like to see her face. He had constructed a version of it in his mind, prepared for the impact the way you brace for a collision you can see coming. The preparation was useless. The face was the same and different simultaneously. The way places are the same and different when you return to them after a long absence. The structure unchanged, but the light coming through at a different angle, making familiar things look like things you're seeing for the first time. Her eyes found his and stayed there. No adjustment period, no social grace of looking away and looking back. She just looked at him, directly, with an expression that was not cold and was not warm and was something more demanding than either. The expression of a person who has decided to see exactly what is in front of them without the interference of what they feel about it. "You found the transfers," she said. "6 weeks ago." Aldrich told me. She moved from the window to the table, setting her coffee down, pulling out a chair and sitting, not inviting him to sit, simply sitting, which was either an oversight or a statement. "What do you have on the shell structure?" He sat. He took the encrypted drive from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. 14 months of transfer records, the LLC architecture, contact logs between Luca and Moretti Council, and a forged authorization memo with a copy of the original signature it was derived from. Aldrich leaned forward. "Is that everything?" "Everything documented. There's more in my operational knowledge that isn't documented anywhere." "We'll need that too." Aldrich glanced at the woman with the laptop. Dana. Dana began typing without looking up. "The financial strike," Roman said. "Walk me through it." Celeste opened a folder that was already on the table in front of her. She'd had it there before he arrived, Roman noticed, which meant she'd been prepared to have this conversation, regardless of whether he showed up or how it went. She was not operating on hope. She was operating on contingencies. Blackwood Global has institutional relationships with the 4 primary banks that hold the Moretti-controlled assets that Luca transferred from your company. If I file simultaneous injunction requests with regulators in Delaware, New York, the Cayman Islands, and Luxembourg, today, within the next 6 hours, I can freeze those assets pending fraud investigation review. She looked up at him. The Morettis have a response structure built for regulatory action. Aldrich has mapped it. They have approximately 4 to 6 hours before they can mobilize their legal teams to contest the freezes. 4 to 6 hours in which the assets are inaccessible and the Delaware filing can't be executed, Roman said. Correct. And during those 4 to 6 hours, Aldrich's federal contacts execute simultaneous search warrants on the Moretti operational structure using the documentation from your drive combined with the 26 months of case material he's already built. She closed the folder. One window. Everything at once. If any single piece of it moves too slow or hits a complication, the window closes, Roman said, and Domenico adjusts, moves the assets, redirects the filing, comes back at both of us from 3 angles with people we haven't accounted for. She held his gaze. So it has to be everything, today. Roman looked at the drive on the table. If I give you this, if I give Aldrich the operational knowledge, I'm giving federal investigators a complete map of the Dragunov organization, not just the Moretti transfers, everything. Yes, Celeste said, that ends my organization. Yes. He sat with that. Not long. There wasn't time, but enough to let it be real. 20 years. The shipping operations, the casino networks, the hotel empire that had started as a cover and become genuinely profitable, the underground structures that had funded all of it in the beginning, the hierarchy of people and debts and favors that constituted a world he had built from the architecture of his father's failures. 20 years of being the most dangerous man in the room. Gone. Not damaged. Ended. What's the alternative, he said. You walk out of here, hire the best legal team available, and spend the next 3 years watching Domenico's lawyers prove that every transfer was authorized. You might get some of it back. The legitimate holdings, maybe. The criminal structure, which is where the real money was generated, that Moretti absorbs, and you never touch it again, and your organization's people either transfer their loyalty to Domenico or disappear. She said it without cruelty. Just sequence. This, then this, then this. And I continue doing what I was already doing before you got on that plane. Aldrich and I had a version of this that didn't require you. She paused. It was slower, riskier on the financial side, more exposure for my funds, but it worked. Then why am I here? Because it's faster with the operational knowledge on your drive, and faster matters when the clock is 48 hours. She looked at him steadily. And because Aldrich thought you deserved the option of choosing this rather than having it done around you. The word deserved landed with a specific weight. He heard everything attached to it, what was said and what wasn't, the long parenthetical of the past 2 years that lived inside that single word like a city inside a photograph. Celeste. He said her name quietly. The room's ambient sound seemed to pull back. Don't, she said. Not harshly, with the same precision she'd been using for everything else. Not right now. We have a 6-hour window that starts the moment Dana submits the injunction filings, and we haven't established the sequencing yet. Whatever you have to say to me, it keeps until this is done. He nodded. One nod. Accepted. They worked. For the next 2 hours, Roman talked and Dana typed, and Aldrich moved between the whiteboard and the table building a map that expanded with each piece Roman provided. Operational nodes, financial conduits, the names and roles of people in the criminal structure that Roman had never written down anywhere because writing them down had always been the fastest way to create a weapon that could be turned back on you. He gave all of it. He gave it methodically, without hesitation, without the omissions that would have been instinctive 2 years ago, and he watched the map on the whiteboard grow into something that he recognized as the shape of his own life rendered in third person, stripped of loyalty and context and all the complicated human reasons why a thing that looks like this from outside can feel like something entirely different from inside. Celeste sat across from him through all of it. Sometimes she asked questions, sharp, specific questions that cut to the financial infrastructure rather than the criminal operations. The kind of questions that revealed she had been thinking about this architecture for longer than today. Sometimes she just listened, her hands flat on the table, her coffee untouched, her face doing that thing he remembered from the early years of their marriage when she was absorbing something complex. A stillness that wasn't absence but concentration, the way deep water is still on the surface. At 1:47 in the afternoon, Aldrich's phone rang. He stepped out of the room to take it. Roman and Celeste were alone. The silence had a different quality without the third parties in it. Thicker, more specific. How old is he? Roman said. Celeste looked at her hands, then at him. 2, in October. What's his name? Eli. He nodded slowly. The name settled into him. Small, clean, 2 letters that somehow contained everything he'd missed. Does he... He stopped. Started differently. What does he know? He knows he has a mother who loves him and a great-grandfather who spoils him and a good life. She kept her voice even. It cost her something to keep it even. He could see the cost in the set of her jaw, the slight elevation of her breathing. He doesn't ask about a father yet. He will. Kids do. She paused. I haven't decided what I'll tell him. Celeste, I said not yet. Her voice cracked on the second word, and she pressed her mouth together hard, and for one moment, just one, he saw through the architecture of what she'd built to the thing underneath it, the same person who had stood in his penthouse 2 years ago with a white envelope in her handbag, and chosen not to speak because she had learned that showing pain to Roman Dragunov was handing him a weapon. She had not unlearned it. She had just expanded the definition of Roman Dragunov to include all the people and situations that demanded that particular protection. He looked away. Not because he didn't want to see it, because looking at it directly felt like taking something from her that she hadn't offered. Aldrich came back in. His face had changed. We have a problem, he said. He placed his phone on the table. The screen showed a photograph. Security camera footage, the timestamp reading 2 hours ago. The location marked as the lobby of Blackwood Global's Chicago offices. 3 men in the lobby. 2 of them Roman didn't know. The third one he recognized immediately. Marco Ferri. Domenico Moretti's head of security. A man whose professional function was specific and whose presence in any lobby was not a coincidence or a courtesy call. Celeste looked at the photograph. Her face went very still. They know I'm here, she said. They know you're involved, Aldrich corrected. They may not know the specifics of today's plan, But ferry at your office building means Domenico has decided that Blackwood Global is no longer a complication to be managed around. It's a target. My people are in that building, Celeste said. Her voice was flat, but her hands had closed into fists on the table, knuckles going white. Dana, get Marcus on the phone right now and tell him to move everyone to the secondary site. Tell him code 7. She was already standing. How long before Ferry's team identifies this location? Unknown. Best case, hours. Worst case, less than that. Roman was on his feet. He was looking at the window, not because there was anything visible, but because threat assessment was a reflex that didn't require a visible threat. Ferry doesn't do reconnaissance. If he's already at your building, he already knows this address. Luca knew I was flying to Chicago. He had my schedule. He had everything. He turned to Aldrich. Your federal contacts. How fast can you get people here? 20 minutes, maybe. Call them now. Aldrich was already on his phone, moving toward the hallway. Dana was on a separate call, rapid and low, her laptop tucked under one arm, moving toward the door. She paused. The injunction filings. I have everything I need on my end. I can submit remotely from anywhere with a connection. Say the word. Celeste looked at Roman. The question was not about the filings. The question was the same one they'd been circling since he walked through the door. The one that had been sitting in the center of the room since she'd turned from the window and looked at his face without looking away. The question of whether this was actually a joint decision or whether she was still, as she had been for 2 years, doing what was necessary alone and simply allowing him to be present for it. Submit, Roman said. Celeste looked at him for one more second. Then she looked at Dana. Submit. Dana walked out of the room already typing. Celeste picked up her coat from the back of her chair. She was moving with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed for contingencies. No wasted motion, no hesitation, the particular economy of a person who had spent 2 years in a world where decisions had financial consequences, measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, and had developed the habit of deciding cleanly and acting immediately. There's a freight elevator at the back of the building, she said. Aldrich showed me when I arrived. She looked at Roman. Can you move fast? Yes. Good. She paused, looked at the whiteboard covered in the map of his former life. Bring the drive. He already had it in his hand. They moved into the hallway together, fast, and Roman was aware of the particular strangeness of moving through space beside her again after 2 years of her being in absence. The specific rhythm of her movement, the way she took corners with her shoulders slightly forward, the sound of her breathing, which was controlled and fast and gave away nothing except that she was running a calculation and the calculation required oxygen. He had spent 7 years sleeping beside this person. He knew the sound of her breathing the way he knew his own heartbeat, and it was disorienting in a way he didn't have time to be disoriented by that he still knew it, that it was still immediately recognizable after 2 years, like a piece of music you haven't heard in a long time that your body knows before your mind catches up. The freight elevator was slow. They stood inside it, and the building moved around them, and Roman watched the numbers descend and listened. Aldrich's people, he said. Do you trust them? I trust the case he's built. 26 months is too long to fake. She watched the numbers too. I don't trust that 20 minutes is a real estimate. It's not. No. The elevator stopped. Ground level. A loading dock, a metal door, the sound of wind off the street before Roman pushed the door open and the cold hit them both. He looked left. Right. The alley was clear. 2 vehicles parked against the far wall. A van. A sedan. He was already doing the calculation. Angles, sight lines, the distance to the street, the position of... The van's side door opened. Roman moved before he'd consciously processed what he was seeing, his hand going to Celeste's arm, turning her back toward the building door, his body between her and the van, in the way that is not heroism, but reflex. The same reflex he'd had for 20 years of operating in a world where doors opening unexpectedly meant something specific. Roman, a voice from the van. Male, tense. Don't! We're Aldrich's. Get in. He looked at the man in the van doorway. Federal. The posture, the vest under the jacket, the earpiece. He looked at Celeste. She was looking at him. At his hand on her arm. At the fact that he had moved without hesitating to put himself between her and the unknown. She said nothing about it. She moved toward the van. They were 2 blocks from the warehouse when the first sound hit, a flat percussive crack that Roman identified before it fully registered. The sound of a door being breached with a ram, coming from the direction they'd left. Then another. Then voices on Aldrich's agent's radio, too fast and technical to fully parse, but the words that came through clearly enough were multiple entry points and 3rd floor compromised and Aldrich is out. Repeat, Aldrich is clear. Celeste's hand was on her phone. Dana. I'm out. Secondary site. Filings are submitted. Dana's voice on the phone, compressed by the connection but steady. All 4 jurisdictions, 15 minutes ago. Celeste exhaled. It was the smallest sound, barely audible over the van's engine and the radio noise and the city outside, but Roman was close enough to hear it, and in it was not relief exactly, but the release of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. It's done, she said to the phone. Stay at secondary. Call me when you have confirmation from Luxembourg. She lowered the phone. The van moved north through Chicago traffic, 2 federal agents in the front, Roman and Celeste in the back with 18 inches between them, the city sliding past the tinted windows in the flat gray light of a February afternoon. Roman's hands were on his knees. Celeste's were in her lap, her phone face down, her eyes on the window. Where's Eli right now? Roman said. With my grandfather. She paused. They're not in Chicago. He nodded. He wanted to ask where, but didn't, because the answer was information she had arranged specifically so that he wouldn't know it. And the fact that he understood this, understood the logic of it from the inside of the person who had made that arrangement, was one of the more painful things he had experienced in a day that had not been short on painful things. Celeste, he kept his voice low. The agents in front were on their radios. I know there isn't a version of what I have to say that's adequate. I know what adequate would require, and I don't have access to it because adequate would mean going back to a morning 2 years ago and being a different person than the person I was, and I can't do that. He paused, breathed. But I need you to know that what happened, the divorce, the penthouse, all of it, I was wrong. Not because I didn't know better, because I made a choice to let it happen, and the choice cost us. His voice developed a fault line he did not manage to conceal. It cost us things that I can't. Roman. She said his name not as a stop, but as a signal. She was still looking at the window. I know. I need to say it. You just did. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. Whatever she was feeling was somewhere deep and structural, not on the surface. What happens next, with Eli? With any of it? I'm not deciding today. I can't decide today. There's too much that hasn't resolved yet, and I'm not going to make a decision about my son's life from the back of a federal vehicle 20 minutes after someone breached the building we just left. She held his gaze. But I heard you. The radio in the front erupted. Both agents snapped forward. The one in the passenger seat turned. We've got movement on Ferry's team. They made the van. He was already reaching for something under the dashboard. We're rerouting. Hold on. The van accelerated. Roman looked out the rear window. A black SUV, 2 car lengths back, maintaining the gap with the precision of a vehicle being driven by someone who knew what they were doing. Then a second one, coming out of a side street ahead, positioning at an angle that was not coincidence. He looked at Celeste. She was looking at the SUVs with the focused expression she'd had at the whiteboard. Not fear, but calculation. Her mind was already somewhere ahead of the moment, already working the problem. The filing confirmation, she said, from Luxembourg. We can't wait for... If Luxembourg confirms all 4 freezes are active and Domenico's liquidity in the U.S. drops by 60% in the next 4 hours. She was talking fast, clean, no wasted syllables. He's moving on us right now because he thinks he still has something to protect. When the confirmation comes through, he has nothing to protect. His incentive changes. He still has Ferry in 2 SUVs 30 seconds behind us. Ferry follows orders. She pulled out her phone. The orders follow the money. She was dialing. Dana, Luxembourg, Tell me you have it. A pause. Roman watched the rear SUV. The agent driving pushed the van through a yellow light, and the SUV came through on red without slowing. Tell me you have it, Dana. The rear SUV was closing the gap. Roman moved. Not toward the window, not toward the agents. He moved across the van toward the equipment locker mounted on the side panel, the kind of locker standard in federal vehicles, the kind that required a code he didn't have, but that had a manual release he'd identified when he got in. Because identifying exits and resources was the first thing Roman Dragunov did in any unfamiliar space, and he hit the manual release with the heel of his hand, and the locker came open. Hey! The passenger agent turned. Focus on the road, Roman said, and pulled a flare from the locker's emergency kit. Dana! Celeste's voice, sharp. Say it again. Dana's voice from the phone, thin and compressed. Luxembourg confirmed. All 4 jurisdictions active. Assets are frozen. Celeste looked at Roman, and for the first time since he'd walked into that room, since he'd watched her turn from the window with that expression that gave nothing away, something changed in her face. Not softness, something more like the specific look of a person who has just watched a plan they built with their own hands function exactly as designed, and the satisfaction of it is complicated by everything surrounding it, but is nonetheless real. She raised her phone and dialed a different number. It rang 3 times. Domenico Moretti answered on the 4th. Check your account, Celeste said. No preamble, no name. All 4 jurisdictions. Then call off your men. A long silence from the other end of the line. In that silence, Roman could hear the sound of a man making the fastest calculation of his life. The frozen assets, the legal exposure, the federal operation that Aldrich's people were executing simultaneously across 6 locations, the evaporation of the thing that Ferry and the SUVs were meant to protect. The passenger agent's radio crackled. Ferry's vehicle is stopping. Repeat. Both vehicles are stopping. Roman looked out the rear window. The black SUV had slowed, had pulled toward the curb, was no longer following. The second SUV, ahead, had moved out of the intersection. Celeste lowered the phone without waiting for Domenico to speak. The van slowed. Chicago moved past the windows, indifferent, enormous, full of ordinary people living ordinary afternoons that had nothing to do with any of this. Roman set the flare back in the locker and closed it. He sat back. He looked at his hands, steady, which surprised him slightly, because what was running through his body in that moment was not calm, but something that had burned through calm and come out the other side. A kind of ringing clarity that he recognized as what happens when a person has spent everything they have and is left with only whatever is essential. He had no empire. He had no organization. He had an encrypted drive in his pocket that he had spent 6 hours emptying into a federal investigation. He had a 2-year-old son in a location he didn't know, being watched over by a 71-year-old man who had every reason to teach the boy that his father's name was a cautionary tale. And he had, sitting 18 inches away from him in the back of a van in Chicago, the woman who had walked out of his elevator carrying nothing except an ultrasound photograph and had turned that nothing into $12 billion, and a life that was, by any honest measure, better and larger and more structurally sound than anything she had built with him. He did not reach for her. He did not say anything else. He sat with all of it, the loss of it, the specific weight of what he owed and could not repay, the long corridor of consequences that stretched ahead of him, and he breathed in and out and waited for whatever came next. The van pulled into an underground garage and stopped. The agent in the passenger seat turned. "We need the drive, Mr. Dragunov." Roman reached into his coat pocket. He held the drive for one moment. 20 years of a life. An entire architecture of decisions and damage and the kind of power that makes a man believe, for long enough, that the belief becomes structural, that power is the same thing as safety, that the absence of vulnerability is the same thing as strength. He placed it in the agent's hand. "There's a man named Vincent Chen in New York," Roman said. "He helped me build the documentation. Make sure he's protected." The agent nodded. Roman got out of the van. Celeste was already out, standing in the garage's fluorescent light, her phone to her ear again, managing the next thing and the thing after that, the operational mind already running ahead of the moment the way it always had. She glanced at him once, a brief, assessing look that contained more than a glance usually holds, and then looked away. From somewhere beyond the garage walls, muffled by concrete and distance but unmistakable, came the sound of sirens. Multiple, moving in coordinated directions. The federal warrants being executed, the operation Aldrich had built for 26 months, finally opening like a mechanism whose spring had been wound to its limit and now, released, was running with the relentless precision of a thing that cannot be stopped. Roman stood in the fluorescent light and listened to the sirens and felt, with a strange and specific clarity, that the sound was the last note of a piece of music that had started 20 years ago. And he had composed it, and it had been very loud, and now it was over, and what came in the silence after it was something entirely different from anything he had ever built or known or been. He looked at Celeste's profile, the line of her jaw, the way she held the phone, the cost written in the set of her shoulders, not of today, but of 2 years, and the years before those years, and the morning in the penthouse, and everything she'd done with the wreckage he'd handed her. She ended the call. She stood still for a moment, facing away from him, and he watched her breathe. In, out, slow, deliberate. The breathing technique from the fertility clinic that he had seen her use before in moments of maximum stress, and had never fully understood until right now, standing in a parking garage listening to the end of his own life. Understanding completely what it meant to use technique to keep yourself upright when what you are feeling is large enough to take your legs. She turned around. She looked at him across the concrete floor of the garage, not 18 inches now, maybe 10 feet, enough space that it was a choice to hold the distance or close it. And she said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, and was the voice of a woman who had decided something that she was going to say clearly and once and not revisit in this moment, when this is resolved, the legal process, the federal proceedings, all of it, I'll give you the chance to meet him. Roman stood very still. One chance, she said. Not because you've earned it, because he deserves the option, not the decision made for him. She held his gaze. But, Roman, if you come into his life, you come in completely. No conditions, no schedule that changes when your world changes, no version of what you were before. Her voice didn't waver. He's 2 years old and he's extraordinary, and I will not let him love someone who is capable of standing 12 feet away and choosing silence. The sirens outside were fading, the operation moving, the mechanism running, the consequence of 20 years completing itself in real time somewhere above them. Roman looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, I understand. And then the lights in the garage went out. All of them, simultaneously, the fluorescents cutting to black, and the emergency strips clicking on a second later in dim red, painting everything the color of something dangerous. And from the stairwell at the far end of the garage came the sound of a door opening, and footsteps, and a voice that Roman recognized before the figure emerged into the red-lit dark. A voice he had heard every day for 11 years, that he had trusted completely, that had told him everything he needed to hear in the way that very skilled people know how to tell you only what you need to hear. Luca Coretti walked out of the stairwell. He was alive. He was walking without difficulty, which meant the Bellevue story had been exactly that. A story, a piece of information planted to make Roman believe the loose end had been managed, to make Roman board that plane to Chicago believing he'd left behind a man who could no longer be a complication. He was holding a gun, and he was pointing it at Celeste. The drive, Luca said. His voice was the same, careful, controlled. The voice of a man managing a meeting. I know you gave it to the federal agent. I need the backup copy you made before you did. Don't tell me you didn't make one, Roman, because I've worked with you for 11 years and I know exactly how you operate. He took one step forward. The backup copy, and then I walk out of here, and whatever happens with Domenico's assets and the federal case and all the rest of it, that's all fine. That's already done. I just need the copy. Roman's hands were at his sides. He did not look at Celeste. Looking at her would tell Luca where the weight was, and Luca already knew where the weight was, but knowing it and being shown it were different things, and Roman needed every fraction of advantage available in this room. There is no backup copy, Roman said. Roman, there is no backup copy, Luca. He kept his voice at the exact temperature of the truth, which was the only way to deliver a lie in front of a man who had spent 11 years reading him. I made the decision on the plane, one copy, one submission, clean. Luca looked at him. 10 feet of red-lit concrete between them, the gun still on Celeste. You're lying, Luca said. Then shoot me and search me, Roman said, and when you don't find it, you'll know I wasn't. The garage was very quiet. Luca's gun hand was steady. His face in the red emergency light was the face Roman had known for 11 years. Composed, measuring, the face of a man who was always running the calculation, and Roman watched it now and saw the thing he had not seen in 11 years of watching it, the thing that had been present all along behind the composure. The look of a man who is afraid and manages his fear by managing everything around him, and when the management fails, the fear is all that's left. It's over, Luca, Roman said quietly. The assets are frozen. The warrants are active. Domenico is finished. He took one step forward, not threatening, deliberate. Put it down. Luca's jaw tightened. The gun shifted fractionally from Celeste toward Roman, and Celeste moved. Not toward Luca. Sideways, fast, dropping below the vehicle beside her, her hand hitting the ground. And in the same moment, Roman crossed the 10 feet of concrete in the way that a man crosses distance when the calculation has already been made and the body executes before the mind has finished approving it. Not running, not rushing, but closing the distance with a directness that did not allow for the hesitation that hesitation would have cost. His hand going for Luca's gun hand at the wrist, his other hand going for Luca's collar, and the gun went off in the space between them. The sound enormous in the concrete garage, a flat crack that hit every wall simultaneously and came back at them from 3 directions at once. And Roman felt the burn across his left side and registered it as information rather than pain, because pain would be available to him later. And right now he had Luca's wrist in both hands and was applying the kind of force that ends arguments about gun ownership very quickly. And the gun hit the concrete floor, and Roman stepped on it, and Luca was against the van with Roman's forearm against his chest, and the particular look on his face of a man who has just spent the last resource he had available. The stairwell door opened again. 3 federal agents. Roman stepped back from Luca. His left side was burning now. The graze, the strip of fire across the ribs that announced itself more loudly once the immediate task was completed. He pressed his hand against it. Not serious. He had felt serious before, and this was not it. He looked across the garage. Celeste had come up from behind the vehicle. She was standing, upright, unhurt, and she was looking at him, at his hand pressed against his left side, at the blood beginning to show between his fingers, at his face, which he was deliberately keeping neutral because the pain was manageable, and showing it felt like asking for something he hadn't earned the right to ask for. She crossed the garage. She stopped in front of him. She looked at his side. Then she looked at his face. She said nothing for a moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her blazer and took out the folded handkerchief she kept there. He had forgotten that about her, that she always carried one, a habit from her grandfather. And she pressed it against his side with a firm, steady pressure, and her hand was warm through the fabric. And Roman stood very still and let her do it, and did not say anything, and did not take his eyes off her face, which was very close to his in the red emergency light of the garage, and was doing something he had not seen it do in 2 years. It was not forgiving him. That was not what this was. Forgiveness was a decision that required distance and time and the resolution of things that were not yet resolved. This was something smaller and more immediate than that. The instinct of a person who, despite everything, despite 2 years and an ultrasound photograph and a son he'd never met, and silence chosen when speech could have changed everything, was standing in a concrete garage pressing a handkerchief against his ribs because he was bleeding and she was the person nearest to him, and some responses exist below the level of decision. The overhead lights came back on, full fluorescent brightness, clinical and flat, flooding the garage and dissolving the red-lit quality of everything that had just happened into the ordinary visual grammar of a parking structure in the middle of a workday. Celeste looked at his side, looked at him, removed her hand. "Hospital," she said. "I'm fine." "Roman." She said his name the way she had at the table, not stopping, signaling. "Hospital." He looked at her hand, which was still near his side, though no longer touching it, And he thought about the 11 years of things that had happened and the 2 years of things that hadn't. And the 2-year-old boy named Eli, who had his eyes, and who was somewhere safe with a 71-year-old man who had once tried to warn her about the world she was walking into. And all the things that still needed to be resolved that could not be resolved in a parking garage on the worst and most consequential day of his life. He nodded. "Hospital," he said, and the federal agents moved in, and the handcuffs went on Luca Coretti's wrists, and somewhere above them in the city, the largest coordinated financial freeze in organized crime history was running its course through 4 jurisdictions simultaneously, and the Moretti Empire was discovering what it felt like to reach for its resources and find only the shape of where they had been. And Roman Dragunov walked toward the stairwell with his hand pressed against his side, and Celeste 2 steps ahead of him, already on her phone, already managing the next thing, as she had managed every next thing for 2 years without him. And he followed her because it was the first right direction he'd had in longer than he could accurately measure. And because the alternative was standing still in a garage that smelled like concrete and cordite and the specific aftermath of a life that had just ended, so that something else, something smaller, quieter, and infinitely more difficult, could begin. The hospital was a level 1 trauma center on the near north side, the kind of facility that handled Chicago's worst nights without blinking. And the emergency room received Roman Dragunov with the brisk, unsentimental efficiency of people who had seen everything and ranked a graze wound somewhere in the lower third of their daily drama. 2 federal agents stood outside the curtained bay. A third sat inside, which Roman accepted without comment because he understood exactly what it meant. He was cooperative, not free, and the distinction would be formalized in the coming days through a process he had already mentally prepared for. The wound was 4 inches across the left flank, a clean channel through skin and the outer edge of muscle. Nothing structural, nothing that would require more than cleaning and closing and a week of careful movement. The ER physician, a woman in her 50s with the manner of someone who had no patience for either dramatics or stoicism, worked on it with efficient hands and told him he was lucky in the flat voice of a person who does not mean lucky as a compliment but as a statement of arithmetic. He did not argue with her. Celeste was in the waiting room. He knew this because the federal agent sitting inside the curtained bay had told him, in answer to a question Roman had not asked aloud, "Ms. Vaughn is still here." The agent had said it the way people say things they've been trained to observe, noting it, reporting it, attaching no interpretation. Roman had nodded and looked at the ceiling of the bay and felt the specific weight of that information settle into him alongside the lidocaine and the sound of the physician's instruments. She was still here. He was discharged 2 hours later with instructions he already knew he would follow imperfectly and medication he accepted without argument. He walked into the waiting room. Beige walls, plastic chairs, the specific ambient noise of a place where people sit with things they cannot fix, and found her in the far corner, her coat folded across her lap, her phone face down on the seat beside her, her eyes on the middle distance. She looked up when he came through the door. She did not stand. She watched him cross the waiting room toward her, assessed his movement for signs of damage, found what she was looking for or didn't, and then looked at his face with the expression she'd been using all day. The one that gave nothing away, and therefore, paradoxically, gave everything away. Because a person who is feeling nothing does not need to be that careful about their expression. He sat down across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The waiting room moved around them, a family in the corner, a man in scrubs crossing toward the exit, the low percussion of an institution that does not pause for personal reckonings. Roman sat with his hands on his knees and his left side aching in a clean, specific way that he found almost clarifying, a physical sensation simple enough to locate and name in a day that had contained many things that were neither. Dana confirmed all 4 freezes are holding, Celeste said. Aldrich's team executed the warrants, 16 arrests, including 3 of Domenico's senior financial officers. She paused. Domenico himself is in federal custody as of 2 hours ago. Luca. Booked at the federal building. Aldrich says he's already asking about cooperation terms. Something crossed her face. Not satisfaction, not disgust, something more tired than either. He'll give them everything. He has no other asset left. Roman nodded. The Delaware filing, he said. Blocked. The injunctions were in place before Moretti's lawyers could execute. The transfer documentation is now evidence in a fraud case. She looked at her hands. The Dragunov assets that were reclassified, most of them will be recoverable through the legal process. Not quickly. 18 months, maybe 2 years of proceedings. She looked up. The legitimate holdings, hotels, the shipping company, the investment portfolio. Those were never actually transferred, but Luca ran out of time. You still own them. He sat with this. The legitimate holdings, the face of the empire, the clean-handed side of a life built on a foundation he had spent 20 years not looking at directly. They'll want the criminal structure dismantled, he said. Yes. I've already agreed to that. She nodded. She had known he had. She was telling him the consequences, not the terms. The terms were already set, already signed into motion by the drive he had placed in the agent's hand in the garage. What remained was the long work of consequence, which was slower and less dramatic than the decisions that produced it, and more permanent. What happens to you? He said. Legally. Nothing. Blackwood Global's role was financial intervention at the request of a federal investigator. Everything we did today was inside the line. She said it without triumph. Inside the line was where she had lived for 2 years. She had made sure of it, deliberately and consistently, because she had known from the beginning that she could not build anything lasting on a foundation she'd have to hide. The fund takes some reputational heat from the association. I've already talked to our institutional partners. Most of them will hold. A pause. Some won't. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. Not with the expression that the apology had maybe expected, not forgiveness, not dismissal, but with the look of someone assessing the specific quality of a statement, measuring its weight, deciding where to file it. I know, she said. They sat for another long moment. Outside the waiting room windows, Chicago was going dark. The late February afternoon collapsing into evening with the sudden thoroughness of winter light, the city's grid of lights coming on block by block in the dusk. I need to see Eli, Roman said. He said it the way he'd said very few things in his life, without strategy, without construction, the words arriving from somewhere below the professional competency that had been his primary voice for 20 years. I need to see him. I'm not asking for anything permanent tonight. I understand what you said in the van. I'm just asking for... He stopped, rebuilt. I've missed 2 years. I don't want to miss tonight if there's a way not to. Celeste was quiet for a long time. He watched her face and did not try to read it, because reading it had been a skill he'd possessed once and forfeited the right to by inattention, and asking it to perform now felt like asking a locked room to open because he'd once had a key. Then she picked up her phone. She dialed. It rang twice. Then a voice came through. Old, unhurried, the voice of a man who had been waiting. And Celeste said, Nathaniel, we're coming. They drove 2 hours north in a federal vehicle, one agent in front, the two of them in back, and the city dissolved behind them into dark farmland and the particular emptiness of Illinois in winter, the flat horizon swallowed by a sky with no visible bottom, and Roman sat with his left side aching and his hands still, and watched the dark go past and felt the hours he had left with any kind of certainty narrowing behind him like a road going to single lane. He thought about what was coming. Not tonight. Tonight was one thing. But the weeks after, which would involve federal proceedings and asset reviews and the careful, public dismantling of the criminal architecture he had spent 20 years constructing. He would cooperate. He had already chosen that. He would be the most cooperative defendant in the history of organized crime cooperation, not because he was frightened, but because he had spent 43 years being the person his life had required and had nothing left to defend on its behalf. What he thought about most, in the dark of the car on the road north, was whether a person can be genuinely different from the person they have been, or whether change was just a word that people placed over the same behavior arranged in a new configuration. He had no answer to this. He suspected the only answer available was the work itself. The daily, specific, undramatic work of being different in small rooms on ordinary days, which was the kind of work that produced no evidence of its own significance until enough time had passed to look back and measure the distance. He had a long time ahead of him to find out. The house was a farmhouse set back from the road, warm-lit windows against the flat dark, the kind of house that declared its function by existing. It was a place people lived in, not a place constructed to communicate wealth or power or anything except occupation. Nathaniel Blackwood had bought it 20 years ago as a retreat and used it for exactly that. And it looked like a house that had been retreated to, worn at the edges in the way that places become worn when they are genuinely used. Celeste got out first. The cold was different up here, drier, darker, the kind of cold that has no city noise to compete with, so you hear it as a kind of pressure in the ears. She walked toward the front door without waiting for him, which was right, and he followed at the distance of someone who understands he is a guest in a situation that was built without him. The front door opened before she reached it. Nathaniel Blackwood stood in the doorway, backlit, and he looked at his granddaughter the way men look at the people they have been worried about when the worry finally resolves, a look that is more exhale than expression. And then his gaze found Roman behind her, and the look became something more deliberate. He said nothing, just held the door. They went inside. The house smelled like wood and something cooking and the specific accumulation of habitation. And in the living room, a lamp was on and books were stacked on a coffee table, and there were small shoes by the door. Tiny shoes, the kind of shoes that are shaped for feet that have not been walking long and are still figuring out the mechanics of the ground. Roman stopped. He looked at the shoes for a moment. Then he heard the sound from the back of the house. Feet on a wooden floor, fast. The irregular gallop of a child who has not yet learned that adults move at a different speed. And a 2-year-old came around the corner from the hallway and saw his mother and said, with the complete undefended joy that children produce before they learn to modulate it, "Mama." He was small. This was the first and obvious thing. He was small in the way that 2-year-olds are small, which is to say that he was smaller than Roman had been prepared for, even though he had known, intellectually, what a 2-year-old was. He had dark hair and dark eyes, the eyes Roman had been told about, the eyes that were not Celeste's, and he wore a blue shirt with something printed on it that Roman couldn't read from across the room. And he ran to Celeste with his arms already up, already reaching before he reached her, and she caught him and lifted him in one motion and held him against her chest, and the sound she made when she held him was very quiet and not for anyone else in the room. Roman stood near the door. Nathaniel was behind him, also still. And Roman understood without being told that this moment required a particular quality of stillness from everyone in it, except the 2 people at its center. After a moment, Celeste turned, the boy on her hip, and she looked at Roman, and then she looked at her son and said, in the quiet, specific voice she used with him that was different from every other voice Roman had heard her use today, "Eli, there's someone I want you to meet." The boy turned. He looked at Roman with the frank, unashamed curiosity of someone who has not yet learned that staring is a social violation. He had a small, serious face. Not unhappy, just deliberate in a way that felt recognizable in a way Roman did not examine directly. "Hi," Eli said. The word was small. 2 letters. The most direct word in the language. Roman crouched down to the boy's level, which pulled at his left side in a way that he absorbed without showing, and he looked at this person who was 2 years old and was his son, and who did not know this, and was looking at him with the same dark eyes that Roman had seen in childhood photographs of himself that his mother kept in the apartment on the Upper West Side. "Hi," Roman said. The boy considered him for a moment. Then he held out the object he'd been carrying in his right hand, a small plastic dinosaur, orange, with one hind leg slightly bent from some past encounter with a hard floor. He offered it to Roman with the uncalculated generosity of someone who has not yet learned that gifts require assessment before they're given. Roman took it. He held it carefully. He looked at it for a moment, and then looked at the boy. "Thank you," he said. Eli seemed satisfied with this. He turned back to his mother and said something about dinner that Roman couldn't fully parse, and Celeste carried him into the kitchen, and Roman straightened up slowly with a small orange dinosaur in his hand and stood in the hallway of a farmhouse in northern Illinois, feeling the full, unmanageable weight of what he had just been given and what he had almost made impossible. Nathaniel came up beside him. He stood there a moment, looking at the kitchen doorway, then at Roman. "I tried to tell her," Nathaniel said. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who has lived long enough to have moved past the point where unkindness serves any function, but who still tells the truth because the alternative is worse. About the world she was walking into. She's always done the opposite of what I recommended. Gets it from her grandmother. He paused. I'm glad she did, mostly. She's more than I would have protected her into being. Roman looked at the kitchen doorway. She told me, Nathaniel continued, that she was going to give you one chance. With him. He let that sit for a moment. She doesn't say things she doesn't mean. You probably know that. I know that, Roman said. Good. Nathaniel moved toward the kitchen. He stopped without turning around. Dinner's almost ready. You can eat or not. It doesn't matter to me. A pause. It might matter to him. He likes having people at the table. Doesn't know yet that people at the table is something you have to choose to be grateful for. He walked into the kitchen. Roman stood for another moment in the hallway with the orange dinosaur in his hand. Then he followed. The weeks that came after had the quality of consequence, which is to say they were slow, unglamorous, and unavoidable. The federal proceedings against the Moretti organization moved through their initial phases with the methodical pace of large legal mechanisms, depositions, document reviews, the careful construction of cases that would hold in courts that required more than operational knowledge and had to have everything translated into the language of admissible evidence. Roman was deposed 14 times in the first 3 months. He answered every question. He offered clarification when clarification would strengthen the case, and volunteered information when the information was material and he had not been asked. His attorney, a careful woman from a firm that specialized in exactly this kind of cooperation, told him after the 4th deposition that he was the most thorough cooperative witness she had encountered in 20 years of practice. He told her it was because he had nothing left to protect, and she had said, with the measured tone of someone who has heard many people say this and learned to wait to see whether they meant it, that they would find out. He meant it. Luca Coretti entered a cooperation agreement of his own, which overlapped with Roman's in ways that the federal prosecutors used to cross-verify both testimonies, and the case against Domenico Moretti and the 11 co-defendants expanded in the early months to include charges Roman had not anticipated, and evidence that Aldrich's 26 months of investigation had developed independently. The trial, when it came, ran 4 months, and Roman testified for 6 days. And on the last of those 6 days, in a federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan, he sat on the stand and gave the final piece of testimony in a measured, direct voice that contained nothing performed. And when he stepped down, he did not look at the defense table and did not look at the gallery, but walked back to his seat and sat down and pressed his hands flat on his knees and breathed. The verdict, when it came 3 weeks later, was a formality. 21 counts. Domenico Moretti would not see the outside of a federal facility for the remainder of his natural life. Isabella Moretti was tried separately on the financial charges that Blackwood Global's investigation had documented over the previous year. Her attorney was good, very good, but Celeste's forensic team had built a case out of materials that good attorneys cannot argue against because the materials are simply what happened, and the jury required less than 2 days. She received 11 years, which her attorney said she would appeal, which she did, and which the appeals court upheld. Roman received a reduced sentence of 3 years, which reflected the scope of his cooperation and the assessment of the prosecutors that, in their formal language, his testimony had been material to outcomes that would not otherwise have been achievable. His attorney called it a win. He did not call it a win. He called it what it was, the consequence, reduced but not eliminated, of 20 years of choices and the right outcome for what he had done. And he served it without complaint. He served it in a minimum security facility in Pennsylvania, which was a world so different from the one he had inhabited for 20 years that the first weeks felt like being dropped into a foreign country without language preparation. He made no effort to establish the kind of position that people with his background typically establish in such environments. He did not negotiate. He did not leverage. He worked in the facility's administrative office, processing paperwork, which was the most available position and which he accepted because it was available. And he read in the evenings, and he slept more than he had slept in 20 years. And he thought about small orange dinosaurs and dark eyes, and what it meant to build something that deserved to exist. Celeste sent photographs. This had not been negotiated. It had not been discussed or agreed upon in any formal way. It simply began, approximately 6 weeks after Roman entered the facility, with a single photograph that arrived in his personal mail. Eli at a table with what appeared to be a birthday cake, both hands in the frosting, an expression of committed joy on his face. No note, just the photograph. A month later, another. Eli in a park, running towards something outside the frame with the full commitment of a person who has not yet learned to approach things partially. Then another. Eli with Nathaniel, the old man bent low to look at something on the ground that the boy was pointing at, both of them serious. An entire conversation happening at knee height. Roman kept them in the drawer beside his bunk. He did not display them. He looked at them regularly, in the specific way you look at something you are trying to understand fully before you earn the right to hold it. He wrote to Celeste once, in the 3rd month. A single page, handwritten, which he had not done since childhood. There was something appropriate about the medium for what he needed to say. Something about the slowness of handwriting that required each word to be chosen rather than produced. He did not write the letter he had been composing in his head for months. The one that tried to explain or account for or demonstrate comprehension of all the specific things that had gone wrong. He wrote a shorter letter. He wrote that he had been looking at the photographs and that he was grateful for them and that he understood it was not obligation but choice, and that he intended to be worth the choice by the time he had served the consequence of the things he had chosen before. He sealed it and sent it and waited. 3 weeks later, a letter came back. It was also a single page, also handwritten, in the angular, precise handwriting he had watched sign divorce papers 2 years ago in a penthouse that no longer existed in the form it had then. She wrote that Eli had started asking questions, not about Roman specifically, he didn't have the reference yet, but about fathers, the way children begin asking about the category before they've fully processed that it applies to them. She had answered him honestly, in the language available to a 3-year-old, and he had absorbed it with the matter-of-fact acceptance that children sometimes show for things adults find devastating, and had then asked whether he could have more juice. She wrote that Blackwood Global had completed its best revenue year on record. She wrote, at the bottom of the page in a smaller hand than the rest, as if she'd gone back and added it after deciding the letter was otherwise finished. He has your hands. I noticed last week. I don't know why I'm telling you this, I just thought you should know. Roman sat in the administrative office with the letter in his hands for a long time after reading that last line. The facility's routine moved around him. The muted institutional sounds, the flat fluorescent light, the specific quality of time in a place where its passage is externally managed, and he sat very still in the middle of all of it, and felt the letter's weight, and understood that this was what the beginning of something looked like when it wasn't dressed in the clothes of a beginning, not a reconciliation, not a promise, not the resolution of the thing that had been broken, which was not the kind of thing that resolves on a timeline that can be communicated in a letter. Just, he has your hands. Just, I thought you should know. He had his hands. The boy had his hands. Somewhere north of Chicago in a farmhouse with warm lit windows, his son had his hands and was growing into them and did not know yet what they meant or where they came from or what kind of man had given them to him. Roman folded the letter, placed it in the drawer with the photographs, sat for a moment longer. Then he went back to work. 3 years is a long time and not a long time, depending on what you are measuring. In terms of a child's development, it is nearly everything. The years between 3 and 6 are the years when a person becomes legible, when the structure of who they are begins to be visible in the way they move and speak and decide. In terms of a business empire, 3 years is one economic cycle, one opportunity missed, and one taken. A series of decisions whose consequences have not yet fully arrived. In terms of a marriage, or what had been a marriage, or what might in some future configuration be a different thing than a marriage but built from some of the same materials, 3 years is not enough and not the point, because these things do not resolve on schedules but on accumulated evidence of change, which takes exactly as long as it takes and cannot be accelerated by wanting. Roman was released on a Tuesday in April, when the trees were just beginning to commit to the season, the particular tentative green of early spring that exists for about 2 weeks before the light gets serious. His attorney was there, a federal officer with release paperwork, a car waiting in the lot. He had one bag. He had arrived with one bag, and he had one bag leaving, which seemed right in a way that was not dramatic but simply accurate. A life simplified to what was essential, which was the only kind of life that could be built honestly on what came next. He sat in the car and looked out the window as Pennsylvania went past, the landscape opening up in the April light, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could pinpoint, something that was not dread or calculation or the specific tension of a man who has been managing something for so long the management has become indistinguishable from existence. He felt simply, plainly present in a moment. He called Celeste from the car. She answered on the third ring. In the background, he could hear what he had learned to recognize from the photographs. The ambient noise of a life being actively lived, a child's voice, something being knocked over and then retrieved, the specific domestic register of a home in operation. "I'm out," he said. A pause. Not long. "I know. Your attorney called ahead." "I wanted to call myself." Another pause. He could hear her moving, walking somewhere quieter, the background sounds of the life receding slightly. "How are you?" He thought about this. It was a different question from the ones he had been asked for 3 years, which had been questions about testimony and cooperation and the legal futures of people who had made choices that needed accounting for. This was the oldest question. How are you? The question that sounds simple and is never simple. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think I need a few days to find out what that answer is." He heard something that might have been, very quietly, the beginning of a sound that wasn't quite a laugh but was adjacent to it, something small and involuntary and immediately controlled, the kind of sound that escapes before a person has decided to let it. "That's an honest answer," she said. "I'm trying to be." The sound of the child in the background, closer now, saying something directed at Celeste, and Celeste responding in that voice, the one that was different from every other voice, and then returning to the phone. "He wants to know who I'm talking to." Roman's hand tightened on the phone. "What did you tell him?" he said. A pause. Longer this time. He could feel the weight of it, the careful selection happening on the other end, the choice being made in real time in the way that all the choices in this particular story had been made, in the actual moment, with incomplete information, by people who were doing their best with what they had. "Someone who is coming to visit," Celeste said. The trees along the Pennsylvania highway were fully budded now, the green definite, committed, spring making good on the promise of the preceding weeks. The car moved through it, and Roman sat with the phone to his ear, and ahead of him, north of Chicago, a farmhouse with warm-lit windows held a boy with dark eyes and hands that looked like his, and a woman who had walked out of his elevator with a white envelope and an empty bank account and had built a world from both, and an old man who had once said, "She's more than I would have protected her into being," and a table where there was always more room than necessary because that was the kind of house it was. "I'll come this weekend," Roman said. "All right," Celeste said, and paused. And then, not as conclusion but as something unfinished in the best sense, the kind of thing that is said because it is true and because the truth of it is larger than any single conversation can hold. "He has your way of going still when he's thinking. I keep noticing it. He goes completely still, and you can see him working through something, and then he moves again, and the thing is decided." A breath. "He gets it from you. I thought you should know that too." The highway opened ahead. The spring continued, indifferent and relentless and good, the way spring always is. Not because anything has been resolved, but because the season has arrived regardless, and the trees do not wait for human reckonings to complete themselves before they commit to green. "Celeste," Roman said, "I'm here." "Thank you." He said it plainly, not as a performance and not as a transaction. The way you say the two words when they are the only two words that have any accuracy, and every other word is beside the point. For the photographs, for the letters, for... He stopped. There was too much inside the four. The way there is always too much inside the small words when they are carrying large things. For not deciding it was finished. A pause that held something in it he couldn't name and didn't try to. "It wasn't finished," she said. "It was broken. Those aren't the same thing." The call ended. The car continued north. The weekend came, as weekends do, ordinary and specific, and not announced by any sound except the change in the quality of Saturday morning light. Roman drove himself, which was an experience still slightly strange after 3 years of institutional transport, The specific freedom of being responsible for the speed of your own arrival. He drove north through the city and out the other side into the flat landscape going green, and he drove the way he did most things now, without rushing, which was new, which was the result of 3 years in a place where rushing produced nothing and patience was the only available currency. The farmhouse looked the same, different season, flowers in front that hadn't been there in February, the trees around it carrying the full weight of their summer preparations. The driveway was unpaved and his car moved slowly up it, and he stopped and sat for a moment with the engine off. The front door opened. Eli came out first because he was at the age where the door opening was an invitation to whatever was outside it, and he came down the porch steps with the attention focused forward and the legs working to keep up, and he got to the bottom of the steps and stopped and looked at Roman getting out of the car. He was bigger. 3 years and 2 months. The math arrived automatically, unbidden. He was bigger, and his face had resolved into itself more. The features no longer the general features of a toddler, but beginning to be particular, his particular, the specific face of this specific person. He looked at Roman. Roman looked at him. "You came," Eli said. He said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of a child who had been told someone was coming and had believed it completely because he had not yet learned to temper belief with probability. "I came," Roman said. Eli considered this for a moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his jeans. He had pockets, small, serious pockets, in jeans scaled for a 3-year-old, and produced a small orange dinosaur. Not the same one, Roman thought, and then looked at it more carefully and thought, or maybe yes, the same one, kept all this time in whatever place 3-year-olds keep their most important objects. He held it up toward Roman with the same uncalculated generosity of the first time, the same offer made without assessment of whether the recipient deserved it. Roman crouched down, his left side pulled, still, after all this time, a reminder. And he took the dinosaur and looked at it and looked at the boy and said, "Thank you." Eli nodded, satisfied as he had been the first time, as if this was the correct answer that he had been waiting to verify. Celeste appeared in the doorway. She leaned against the frame with her arms loosely crossed, watching, not intervening, watching. The afternoon light came from the west, warm and flat, the kind of light that makes everything look like it is slightly more itself than usual, and it caught the angle of her face, and Roman straightened up from the crouch and looked at her across the yard, and she looked back, and neither of them said anything. Eli took Roman's hand. He did it without ceremony or announcement, just reached up and closed his small hand around Roman's fingers, the way children do when they have decided that the person next to them is someone worth being next to, without requiring reasons, without requiring proof. The simple decision of proximity made in the uncomplicated grammar of trust. Roman looked down at his son's hand in his. He thought about the ultrasound image. The small black and white photograph that had traveled in a white envelope from a clinic on 5th and Madison to an airport to a one-way flight to a brown carpet apartment, and had been kept somewhere for 3 years in a woman's most private keeping, and was still somewhere in the world, still existing, still carrying the 7 words that had been written on its back. If you ever choose us, find us. He had found them, not in the sequence the words implied, not through the clarity of a man who had seen clearly and chosen well, but through the back door of failure, through the slow excavation of what was real that happened when everything constructed on top of reality had finally been stripped away. He had found them the wrong way. He had not deserved to find them. He would spend the rest of whatever he had left trying to be worth having found them, which was not the same as deserving it and never would be, and was the only honest starting place available. Eli tugged at his hand. He wanted to show him something. There was something in the yard, a caterpillar or a stone or a patch of ground that had distinguished itself from other patches of ground by some quality only a 3-year-old could perceive. And Roman let himself be led, the way you let yourself be led when the person leading you knows something you don't, and the knowing is more valuable than any direction you might have chosen for yourself. He walked across the yard in the April light with his son's hand in his and the orange dinosaur in his other hand, and behind them Celeste pushed off the doorframe and came down the steps and followed. And Nathaniel appeared in the doorway and watched them go with the particular expression of a man who has been in the world long enough to know that most things do not end well, and the ones that do are worth every preceding difficulty and do not require commentary. The afternoon held them. Not resolved. That was not the right word. Resolution implied a return to equilibrium, a system returning to rest. And this was not that. This was something still in motion, still changing, with work ahead of it that could not be completed in an afternoon or a season or maybe even a decade. The damage was real and its dimensions were known, and the knowing of them did not disappear because the afternoon was good. But the afternoon was good. Eli found what he'd been leading them toward, a particularly large stone near the fence line, remarkable for reasons that required his specific perspective to appreciate, and crouched over it with the intensity of a scientist, and asked Roman what was under it, and Roman crouched beside him and said he didn't know, and Eli said they should look. And they turned the stone over together and found the ordinary small life that lives under stones, the insects and the disturbed soil, and the elaborate small civilization that has nothing to do with human things and continues regardless. And Eli watched it with his whole face, and Roman watched Eli, and Celeste stood a few feet back with her hands in her coat pockets, and the afternoon light on her face, and the stone sat turned over between them, its secret, ordinary, and sufficient. This was what remained. Not empire, not the architecture of power that a man spends 20 years building because he believes the building is the point, and discovers too late that the point was always the thing the building was meant to protect. Not the fear of other men, which had felt for 20 years like the closest available approximation of safety. Not the performance of strength, which had required him to stand 12 feet from a woman carrying his child and choose silence because showing what he felt had seemed, in that moment, like weakness, and it turned out to be the most expensive decision he ever made. What remained was this: a stone in a yard, a small hand, a woman standing nearby who had built a world out of nothing and had, improbably, left room at the edge of it, the kind of room that does not announce itself, that is simply there, if you are the kind of person who has done the work of becoming small enough to fit inside it. Roman looked at his son. His son looked at the insects under the stone. The afternoon held,